theme parks.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Amusement parks.
Amusement parks. And we...
First I wanted to go there, then I cancelled it because I had to meet.
Okay, colleagues, next item on the agenda is the flight and duty time state of play. Presentation by the Commissioner, Mr Baldwin, of course, and we've also got Mr Clouseau from the EASA. Just to make a couple of points before we start. The obvious one, of course, is that this is the competence of the Transport and Tourism Committee, despite the efforts of others, and because it's a safety issue, so we will be dealing with it. As the former rapporteur for the original EU Ops, I shall be watching it carefully, and I know Mr Al-Khadraoui is as well, because of course this is done under comitology. It is worth repeating because people keep saying, why don't you amend this and amend that? We can't, it's under comitology. So at the end of the day it will be a yes or no decision. But we thought it would be a good idea to get both Mr Clouseau, but especially Mr Baldwin here, just to give us a state of play with where we are at with the EASA proposals. So, Mr Baldwin, the floor is yours. There you go.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. FTL. Well, I've come before this committee in the past to discuss this important issue and just to state right from the top of the dossier, the most important thing, in fact, frankly, the only thing we should be talking about here is safety. Safety is paramount for us, I know for you as well, and indeed for, I think, all the players, all the stakeholders. Where does the Commission stand? We are committed to improving, and let me say what that means in the sense of making more stringent the current EU rules concerning flight time limitations. It was clear back in 2006 that the rules we have, the so-called EU Ops, needed to be clarified and indeed complemented in the light of the latest scientific and operational developments. So we asked EASA, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jean-Marc Clouseau today, back in 2009 to undertake the task of reviewing these FTL rules, including a thorough consultation of all the stakeholders. EASA has done exactly that in producing their opinion in 2012. And I think it's worth restating. For 3 years, EASA have conducted a thorough and lengthy process, including the evaluation of the current EU FTL rules and practices, the analysis of scientific and operational data, and in several lengthy public consultations. They were assisted in this task by a group of experts from all stakeholders concerned and by 3 scientists. Now, to answer where we are on the file, Mr Chairman, no formal Commission proposal has yet been made. Our goal is to try to obtain, and it's a delicate and a difficult task, the acceptance of all the stakeholders on this file before we submit a proposal. As you said, Mr Chairman, it will be submitted under comitology to the EASA committee, experts from the Member States, but before adoption, of course, there is the 3-month period of scrutiny for both the Council and the Parliament. We have come before the Parliament several times since October, when the EASA opinion was published, in order to explain the issues at stake. I hope we've kept you, Mr Chairman, and indeed the Standing Comitology Rapporteur, Mr Al-Khadraoui, fully informed over the past months on how it's evolving, and in particular on our efforts to address the different concerns that have been raised. But it's very good to have the chance to brief the wider committee today on where we stand and indeed to answer the questions you may have. So, where have we got to? Our discussions with stakeholders have led us to consider what I would describe as a number of clarifications on the possible upcoming proposals. As I think we foresaw when we last spoke, a lot of these come under the areas of so-called soft law. That means, in its terrible jargon, for which I apologise, the areas of certification, specification, or acceptable means of compliance. And when I say consider these possible clarifications, I use this phrase with care. No decision has yet been taken by the Commission to make any changes to the EASA opinion or indeed on the shape of any proposals. And I don't want to speak for the unions in particular, I believe these clarifications have the potential to address most, if not all, of the concerns that have been expressed by the aircrew representatives. For example, several examples concerning the questions of airport duty, the consideration of reserve as duty, or indeed in the question of in-flight rest for cabin crew. In addition, we have worked with EASA with a view to trying to address a few other issues which have required more substantial adjustments, such as delayed reporting, the question of reserve, and indeed the famous issue of standby. And we remain ready to make important efforts in terms of adaptations that respond to real and documented safety concerns on all of these issues. However, we do have some problems in responding to some of the requests that have been made of us. Let me mention as one example the request on us to prevent cabin crew being required to perform ground duties at the airport. Now, the safety implications of performing ground duties at the airport have been addressed by the EASA proposal in the sense that we have established that these duties need to be considered as part of the flight duty period and would therefore limit the duration of any subsequent flight duties. But on this issue, we have a legal impediment on us because we are regulating, as I said right at the start, safety. We're not regulating labour regulations. We do not have here a legal basis for regulating labour relations in this area. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm being a bit long, for which I apologise. We think there are some adjustments that could be made without affecting the equilibrium, but it's a really delicate balance. Our scope for making these adjustments is very limited. Some of the airlines have indicated that they too had difficulties with the original text from EASA, but of course coming from the opposite direction. Member States, in our discussions with them in the EASA committee, have also recognised the delicate balance of EASA's suggestions and have requested the Commission not to overdo it, not to affect the equilibrium. Their remit in EASA was to try to identify the best safety solution with the least possible negative impacts, and that's why it's essential for us, and indeed I hope all stakeholders, for keeping this in mind when looking at the EASA opinion and when assessing possible adjustments to be made. If the same level of safety protection can be achieved by different means, by combining different prevention or mitigation measures, we believe we should be choosing the means which are the least burdensome and indeed, let's be frank, the least costly to implement. Just as one example on that, in terms of the famous night duty question, EASA has proposed an 11-hour duty maximum combined with an active monitoring of night duties going beyond 10 hours. We think that is the cost-effective way of and a safe way, and the most important, of course, being the safe way of doing this. I think there has been recognition of the merits of this approach, and of course, particularly from airlines. They are ready to look at some of the adjustments we have proposed. I am ready to ask them formally to make these additional efforts, but I think it's fair in keeping this balance that we do not disregard the impact on them when making the final adjustments. So once again, we have not taken a final position on FTL. We want to be sure of the implications and we want to be sure of the position of all stakeholders. We will continue to listen to you to explain the technical issues at your request. We will come and explain them further and to keep you fully informed of the progress on the file. I hope the waiting is nearly over in terms of our proposal. I know, Mr. Chairman, you're keen for us to get on with it. But again, let me be very frank. Let me be clear on the risks of making proposals for major adjustments that would destabilise the essential balance of the EASA opinion, or indeed that would create legal difficulties for all of us in implementing these rules. We don't want to see further delay. I think all stakeholders have told us in different ways they want to avoid such delay. They want to get on with realising the huge potential improvements in safety which are within our grasp. I hope this has been a useful overview. We're of course ready to answer your questions. I may, with your permission, turn to Jean-Marc Clouzot for answering any more technical questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know whether, Jean-Marc, you want to say anything now or whether you just want to wait for questions. That would be helpful. I've got Mr. Grosch.
Ja, vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the introduction. Actually, I only have 2 or 3 relatively clear and simple questions. If I understood correctly, you haven't yet made a final decision as to which changes you will suggest. You're still considering the issues. The Commission hasn't made a decision yet. I'd like you to confirm that. The second thing, if I compare the situation with that of road transport, I feel safer on the ground than in the air. Well, if we look at driving times and rest times, and working time overall, you have different legal bases for these time periods, and we have introduced definitions of driving time and working time to ensure that they can be observed. Why can that not be done here too? If there are issues relating to working time, we have to be able to provide clear responses. Perhaps this can be regulated in a clear way. My last issue relates to technical recognition. Now, we as MEPs listen to many different views. We've heard a lot about safety, about fatigue, and we've heard very different views. I'd like to know whether the Commission, when it makes its decision, will draw on what was said in the high-level group by the experts in the studies, or whether it will draw on other forms of experience, other reports from different sectors. That was my third and last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. El-Khadraoui.
Ja, dank u wel.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank Mr. Baldwin and the whole of his team for this briefing and for all of this preparation. It's taken many years, and it isn't finished yet. I'd like to remind everybody here that the coordinators agreed that when the Commission had a final proposal, we would organise a hearing to receive information and to enable stakeholders to state their views. Obviously, we're talking here about a very technical and complex subject, very technical indeed. A great many different possibilities to be explored. And obviously we at Parliament would prefer to have a proposal which is supported by all concerned. I hope that within the next few weeks and months all stakeholders will find that the proposal is reasonable and well balanced and guarantees safety in the air. And it's important that the rules that are established, that the legislation should be constantly assessed and adjusted. So my question in this respect is, once the rules have been decided upon, what's going to happen in terms of assessment and adjustment? What steps are you going to take to learn from experience when the new legislation is implemented? Now some more technical questions. You made a reference to night duty, flight times, 11 hours. Now that's a sensitive issue. A lot of stakeholders are saying that more than 10 hours could be dangerous. You're contesting that. In the US it's 9 hours. How do you explain the difference in approach between the United States and the European Union in this area? And can you assert that this is never unsafe in any circumstances? And if you say this, on what are you basing that statement? I'd also like to talk about the non-regression clause. The principle that member states can do more in terms of safety than we provide for. Will that continue to be so in future? And what is the linkage with harmonisation? Because that is also an objective that we're pursuing. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender, und vielen Dank.
Yes, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Baldwin, for your report. You said that safety was the key factor. Now, we've heard a comparison with road transport. I think that if we look to the future, one day there might not be pilots anymore. We might have planes that fly themselves, and the way knowledge is expanding, that might even be safer. But at the moment, we're happy to have pilots, and pilots are people, and people need rest. So we want safety to be guaranteed. As has already been said, we're going to be organising a hearing. Now, we took that decision to gather information from all sides because we're being approached by the airlines and by the cockpit organisation, and we're receiving very different information about what is reasonable. We've talked about night duty, and we have to look at that in relation to standby time. And where is this standby time? Is it at the airport? Is it at home? Where are you able to sleep? There are lots of aspects that we need to discuss here. The most important question for me is what happens next? What is the procedure to be? We've had discussions at expert level, independent discussions. Now we have proposals on the table. So what happens next? Is the Commission going to present us with an updated proposal, which we will then consider? What is going to happen? That's my main question. Thank you.
Mrs. Foster.
Thanks, Chairman, and thanks to Mr. Baldwin and for coming along to give us an update today. Well, as former airline crew, I think I can probably speak with some authority here, because I flew for more than 20 years. I was also a trade union representative, and I wrote the long-range agreement in 1992 when the 747-400 well, British Airways bought them, and it was the first time it was one stop to Australia. So clearly you were going to then look at challenges in terms of long-range and long-haul flying. Notwithstanding that, I'd also been involved in the short-haul agreement going back probably 15 years before that. So I think I'm a reasonably good authority on whether it's short-haul or long-haul flying. Notwithstanding, the key issue for me, and I don't say it lightly, is safety. An airline doesn't have a business unless it has a good safety record, because who wants to fly on a carrier where their safety is compromised? So it's in everybody's interest that we get to the right conclusions here. I think we should also recall, as Chairman says, he was the rapporteur. I was shadow for EPP at the time, and it was obviously a difficult situation we were in because it's a very emotive subject. But EU Ops Subpart Q was brought in because a lot of member states didn't have any maximum limits for planning or maximum limits or minimum limits for rest across the EU. From the UK's point of view, we had CAP 371, and notwithstanding, we also had collective agreements in some other member states. And at the time, 10 years ago, this was the reason to try and bring something in so there was something across Europe. Now, some people may not have liked that, but I happen to think actually it was a pretty good idea. I'm at the moment as a UK MEP in quite a difficult position because we're now moving from a transition from CAP 371 in the UK to EU Ops, and there's also been the revision of EU Ops when you're looking at long haul. So I've got BALPA on one hand, and I've been delighted to have a chat with BALPA, and obviously then others from the European Cockpit Association. So from what I've seen so far, I understand that the working group is still looking at some of these issues that have been raised. If we're looking at standby, if we're looking at from the UK position, it was about earlies, etc., how many you could do consecutively. In terms of night duty, people need to tread with caution here. Most long-haul flights going to the other side of the world will be going during the night, and they'll have planned duties of 15.5 hours or more. That's why they have things like bunk rest. They'll have what's called heavy crew. We call it heavy crew in any event. And there's no reason to believe that any of that will change at all. I think what we've also said is there are clearly some issues now that still need to be worked upon, if you look at standby, but from what I have seen so far, with apart from a couple of things, I am quite confident that the conclusions that you are coming to through EASA and also with the UK CAA having looked at this very closely, and we've had select committee meetings with all sides to discuss this, I think it's going in the right direction. I've been very disappointed with the campaign, I have to say, with the campaign from the pilots. On some occasions, I do not like professional bodies frightening the public to death and insinuating that every time you walk into a flight deck, the pilots are asleep. I flew for 25 years, I worked all sorts of hours, and I never walked into the flight deck of one of my aircraft and saw a pilot asleep. I'm not saying it's not happened. If it has happened, then there is something that is absolutely wrong with that company and perhaps the person themselves. So that has to be taken very seriously. But I think you have to run a good, structured campaign. We're all here to listen. We all want the best outcome at the end of the day. And I think we're on the right path, Mr Baldwin and EASA. And I think that, as I say, apart from 2 or 3 things, I think that probably need a bit more clarification. I think this should be able to come to this Parliament. We should be able to accept it. We should then be able to monitor it, and I've offered to do that with pilots, looking at rosters confidentially over the next 12 months. I can write rosters. I can write an illegal roster under CAP 371, and I can write an illegal roster under EU Ops. I don't think any company is looking to try and do that, because they're not going to be in business for too long. So I think that we have to be constructive about how we deal with this, and I think then we can look at how it's working. The national association authorities can have a look and see if there are any problems which we can then adjust and come back to. But overall, I'm quite satisfied with where we've got to at this moment in time. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Mrs. Lichtenberger.
Ja, herzlichen Dank.
Yes, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I haven't really learnt a lot more today about what the details of the Commission's plans are. I remember the debate about EU Ops and the request that we made as the European Parliament. We wanted it to be science-based. We wanted that type of information on this subject. Thank you, Mrs. Foster, for your comments. Unfortunately, you're speaking without a microphone, so I couldn't hear it. Yeah, your microphone is on, actually. You've left it on. The decisive point, as far as I'm concerned, is this. We need it to be scientifically based, whatever the results are, and I'm certainly willing to read all of this and these studies, because I've looked at working times, driving times in the past, and I want to know all the details, what it's all based on. The details are going to be the important things, very, very small things, such as the ratio between free time, duty time and standby. That is going to be key. How is standby going to be managed? Will it be seen as something which is very close to free time? To what extent is it working time? What about people's how it fits into people's lives? How often are the pilots actually called up? I want to know all of that before I can decide whether what is being suggested is acceptable or not. And I know very few of the details so far, but some questions have arisen from what I've heard. If I look at the US rules and the EU rules and the differences between them, I wonder whether Europeans need less rest, less sleep than Americans. Is it perhaps because of a bad diet? What are these differences due to? You say that this is scientifically founded. These are all human beings. So the differences between the US and America can't be that great. Secondly, Over the past 10 to 15 years, there have been a great many differences, developments. I mean, I've talked to people in Germany, and a great deal has changed. Obviously, stewards or air hostesses no longer have to wear 8-centimetre heels or things like that, or there are no longer weight limits, but the distances are longer, the flight times are longer. What used to be a pleasant atmosphere to work in has become far more difficult, and this is due to the rise of the low-cost airlines in many respects. A lot of groundwork is required now, a lot of additional tasks, and sometimes these things are classified as rest time. I feel that this is not acceptable for the cabin crew. And there too we need clear rules. As Mr. Grosch has already said, we have had endless discussions about driving times and rest times for lorry drivers. Now we have to do the same here. We have to avoid abuses. I don't want the reckless to win. We need a balance. We need equilibrium. We have to limit as much as possible the room for abuse. Finally, the fact that some member states can have stricter rules. I'd like to know more about that. If we only establish minimum standards, we have to remember that in the low-cost sector, there are lots of possibilities for dumping. We see that on the roads already. I don't want it to happen in the air too.
Ja, dank u wel.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a few comments. First of all, we're talking here about safety. It's a very important subject. We're talking about the cockpit crew, and we mustn't forget the cabin crew. Before I became an MEP, I worked in the airline sector for the Dutch government, and there were two big changes in the Netherlands and in Europe during that time. Turnaround times have been hugely reduced. The pressure of competition has increased too. And I think that in the new legislation it is extremely important that attention should be paid to rest times. And in this respect, I am worried by what we have on the table so far. And I'm thinking first and foremost of night flights. The difference with the United States has already been pointed out. And EASA is now talking about 10 or even 12.5 hours. I think that that is unacceptable. Academics tell us, scientists tell us that 10 hours is the absolute limit for night flights, and we must not exceed that. I would like to hear the Commission say that explicitly. Then I'd like to talk about standby, daily working times and standby. The initial starting point was 22 hours. Now, I can't imagine what that might mean. It's 16 hours in the United States. I think that our figure should be close to that. So perhaps we could aim for 18 as a maximum. In any case, I would like more clarity on this point from Mr. Baldwin. Third point, with regard to our agreements at EU level, it's important to underline that we're talking about minimum levels. We need a legal minimum. But if there are member states that want to be stricter, that want to go beyond what is required, they have to be able to do so. I think you have seemed slightly reticent in this respect, but I feel it's important for us to set minimum standards together and allow member states to go further. I'm not keen on this proposal, I have to say, and I await Mr. Baldwin's reactions to my specific questions.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, Mr. Baldwin, you have seen that there is a red flag flying around this table. We don't want any experiments, and we don't want to enter into any compromise on safety. Several colleagues have said this. I also sent a written question to the Commission on this. Ms. Lichtenberger mentioned this as well, and we haven't really received any more information. There are 4 points that I wanted to raise that I think need to be addressed. First of all, as has already been said, the recreation clause. I think if member states are to have better rules, then that has to be binding. Secondly, standby times. It reminds me of the General Working Hours Directive, where the Court of Justice said clearly that on-call time in a hospital is working time. I think standby time has to be working time here as well. Limit of 10 hours on night flights. Mr. El-Khadraoui is right, Mr. Said is right. We as Europeans are not necessarily any fitter than Americans, and who feels responsible for this file? The Commission refers to EASA. EASA refers to the scientists wherever they have popped up from, the different views. Member states refer to the Commission. And I'm wondering whether the responsibility lies here in Parliament.
Mr. Kramer.
Ja, ich wollte auch.
Yes, I wanted to say that the Court of Justice decided that on-call time is working time, and there was a lot of upheaval on this in Germany because it was said that there had to be adaptation in hospitals for doctors, and I said I don't want to be operated on by a doctor who's been at work for 30 hours. I'd rather go to another one. I want that guarantee as a patient. Yes, the doctor knows exactly what I'm talking about. He doesn't want to still be awake after 30 hours and operate on someone and try not to make any mistakes. EU, USA, well, say what you're referring to. You knew. I mean, we're all familiar with the rules. You have studies saying that the Europeans are just better people than Americans. The Americans are all weak. They need to rest. Europeans don't. Say where you got the information from. The turnaround times, very interesting point as well. I mean, we should have had that for passenger rights as well. Between landing and take-off, there should be half an hour or 2 hours. It needs to be regulated. Earlier, there were longer times. It's changed because the airlines are just going for profit. So they want to have 10 or 20 flights for each aircraft every day. That's why they don't want to even rest at night time. It's because profit is top of their list, and they're not interested in anything else. Last point, EASA has the image in Europe that they're the most successful lobby group. They're the most successful lobbyists, and I get the impression that that's correct.
I wouldn't go there with German railways. Mrs. Ayala Sender.
Sí, gracias.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry that I couldn't be here for the presentation to hear the Commission, but I do agree with most of my colleagues. I also agree with Mr. Simpson on the origin of all of this and the negotiation. And right from the beginning, it was clear to us that there was a need for there to be no compromise on safety. So we've started including new rules on slots, vertical slots, approximating aircraft. We also said that we had to take account of the environment. There are different conditions. I understand that all of this is part and parcel of the responsibility requirement, and that there has to be a counterpart in terms of safety. The standard is a de minimis standard, and then each member state can have more stringent rules on top of that if it so wishes. But we know from experience that airlines go from one state to another to get the best tax conditions or labour conditions, and the same goes for safety. They won't adhere to the more strict rules. They'll just relocate to places where safety standards are lower. So it's important not to accept any reduction in any area. I know we buy all the worst things from the USA, and when things are going well, we say, oh, well, there are more obvious and more stringent standards, say, for protection of working hours, particularly for night flights. Well, I understand that any incident, I don't want to say accident, but any future incident, I mean, taking account of what's happened between Boeing and Airbus, the more demanding the standards are, the better guarantee of safety we have for our airlines, our pilots. So I agree with colleagues that say that we shouldn't make any concession whatsoever on safety.
Thank you. If I could put my fourpenneth in as well, as says the guy who did the original report and had great difficulty, let me tell you, getting an agreement between airlines and the trade unions, be they cockpit or be the ETF at the time. Great difficulty. I wish you well, Mr. Baldwin. If you can get agreement with the trade unions, I'd be the first to say that that is and indeed a breakthrough in itself, and I think it is a matter of balance. There are issues with standby duty. From what you tell me, you are actually looking at that. Fine, there's no proposals at the moment. I remind members there's no proposals at the moment. Sometimes feel that there's a criticism aimed at the Commission, but I don't know what the criticism is based on, because they haven't come up with their proposal yet. By all means, criticise their EASA proposal. I think that does need to be looked at. Can I just say one again, going back to when I did the original? I just ask members to be careful making direct comparisons with the United States, because it's like doing apples with pears. It's a completely different system in the United States. It's organised differently. It's a different market even. It's a bit like asking the United States freight train drivers to do everything that our passenger train drivers do. It's a completely different system. So do be careful in doing that. And not everything in the United States is rosy. How many 40-odd-year-old aircraft are still flying in the United States on regular commercial services? I refer to the MD-90s, MD-92s. You know, so our friends in America, we love them dearly, but it isn't the great panacea of everything wonderful in civil aviation. So just be careful on that. The 2 points I wanted to raise. First of all, I often hear that as an accusation that EASA and Commissioner have not done any impact assessments on all of this. How would you react to that? And the second one I want to know is, I get told so many times about you need to look at the science. I'd like to know where it is. Where is the science? And I mean proper scientific reports on these things, because frankly they don't exist. There may be a report done by one side that says this is fine because we've commissioned it, and another report done by the opposite side saying this is fine because we've commissioned it. Oh, and by the way, we've used science. But I have not seen a proper, thorough, 100% scientific study on flight and duty time. Now, if it exists, I'm happy to look at it if somebody can guide me in that direction. But when people keep saying we should use the science, I don't know what they mean, because it doesn't necessarily exist. Final point, as I understand it, can confirm this or not, present EU ops, the Simpson report, nighttime duties, the maximum is 11 hours 45 minutes. So the proposal from EASA drops that to 11 hours. Have I got that right? So it's dropping it 45 minutes. Okay? If that becomes the proposal coming towards the Parliament, then we have to take a decision on the whole package to accept it or not. So what we could do is, we could reject the EASA proposal and insist that 11 hours 45 minutes remains in place. Because if you reject it, you're left with the status quo of EU ops. So I just say to the members, be careful what you wish for. Yes, we need to try and get the Commission, influence the Commission, try and get that agreement with the trade unions that you can come forward with a proposal. But I repeat again, colleagues, at the end of the day, your vote is yes or no. And if you vote no, which is your right, you're left with the Simpson proposal, which, of course, I would say was wonderful in the first place, but I have to say is worse than what is being proposed from EASA. Okay, who wants to answer first?
Well, firstly, thank you very much. And I'm conscious I have a lot of expertise to my direct right and to my left as well in this room, which we are very committed to continuing to listen to and to draw on. And in that respect, I'm very pleased about this hearing in May, and we look forward to participating in that, as I'm sure do a number of the stakeholders present in this room. Mr. Chairman, perhaps I could begin with your questions out of courtesy. On the question of an impact assessment, I think there are two questions here. The first is an impact assessment in the sense of what EASA, bless them, have been doing for the last 3 years, looking consistently with stakeholders, all the stakeholders, at precisely this question: what will happen if? Can we adjust here and there, and trying to build an opinion on the basis of that? That has been thoroughly done. Of course, there's a second question, which I should answer correctly institutionally, which is a Commission impact assessment on top of that, and all I can say at this stage is that we are considering inside the Commission whether a further full impact assessment is necessary, and I can't indicate at the moment whether that will be the case. On the science, I'd like to ask Jean-Marc to say a word, but let me jump right in, because a number of speakers have mentioned with the question of the night flight times. Mr. Chairman, you're quite right about what the current EU rules permit. It's 11 hours and 45 minutes of flight time during the night. We are proposing, EASA are proposing more protective rules in this area, using 4 mitigating measures, which we think together will provide for greater protection in this very sensitive area. So, firstly, as you say, reducing the flight duty limit to 11 hours. Secondly, asking operators to apply fatigue risk management principles for night duties that are longer than 10 hours. Thirdly, by applying strict limits, actually stricter limits, I should say, than what is currently allowed under EU OPS, during the time window between 5 o'clock in the afternoon and 6 in the morning. At the moment, under EU OPS rules, you can do 11 hours and 45 minutes of flying between 10 o'clock in the evening and 5 in the morning. And we are proposing 11 hours between, EASA are proposing 11 hours between 7 o'clock and 6. So I'm sorry, that's a bit complicated, but this is a clearly more restrictive window. And finally, requiring additional rest, a weekly rest period of 60 hours instead of 36, where people have been subjected to the disruptive schedules that come from this kind of night flying. We think that the EASA opinion in this area provides really an equivalent basis to the most protective national rules that are currently in place. From our initial soundings of them, the EASA opinion is strongly supported by member states. Indeed, supported by the operational experience of many member states who've been operating, frankly, safely with the higher limit of 11 hours and 45 minutes. So those are the answers I wanted to give to you. To Mr. Grosch, going right back to the start, you're quite right. No final decision has been reached within the Commission as to possible changes, and so we're still, the EASA opinion is on hold, being looked at, being discussed, being teased again to see if there are the marginal changes that I discussed in my opening statement. Mr. Grosch, you then raised a very important question concerning comparisons to road, which I'm not equipped to make. I'm not a road expert. But what this comes down to is really what the relationship is between safety and the social rules. And this was raised by a number of people, and I wanted to try to, again, address that head on. What the revised rules would allow for, as with the current EU ops, is the application of more protective social legislation and collective agreements, unimpaired. There is no connection between the flight time limitation system and what has been negotiated, should be negotiated, could be negotiated in collective labour agreements. And then beyond that, the relationship between these two rules is and should be and will be based on the principle that the more protective rule still applies. So in accordance with this principle, the new FTL rules that we have will state that the provisions of the new regulation are entirely without prejudice to any more protective social legislation applied in member states or indeed collective labour agreements. So if you want to consider this from a purely social perspective, and I understand that people do, we're saying it's about safety, but of course people want to look about what the package is. The more detailed rest and the more detailed cumulative duty requirements included in the ops have the potential side effect of bringing more protection to workers when you factor in the national social legislation and collective labour agreements. For example, Directive 2079 lays down minimum rest per month and year and a maximum duty per year, whereas the EU ops also contains minimum rest per week and per day, as well as maximum duties per week, per month and per year. And then, in addition, EASA proposed to complement the FTL rules with additional rest twice a month, or following more fatiguing duties, as well as establishing a cumulative duty limit for each 14-day period and for each 12 consecutive month period. On the question of what we will draw on, you mentioned the high-level group and the studies and what we will try to learn in science, and I think there's again been a number of comments on that. Again, I'll ask Jean-Marc, who has been wading in the science for 3 years, to say more on that. But all I can say is we will draw heavily on all the sources available. You could probably fill this room, Mr. Chairman, with the amount of things that have been written about this. And I think Jean-Marc has probably read and digested all of them. So I really think he's the best person to address this. Mr. El-Khadraoui, again, pleased to hear about the hearing. We're very happy to participate if invited. I quite understand what you want to see, and what I want to see too is a package that is widely supported and has the support of all stakeholders. I asked Jean-Marc to say more about the US system, but seeing as so many people have raised it, let me try to say a word about this. What we have here, and it is complex to understand, is a package of interlinked measures, and it makes the direct comparisons with what happens in the US, the weaklings in the US, as you described them, or anywhere else around the world, rather difficult. So when you assess the level of fatigue that comes about by a 10-hour flight duty period or an 11-hour flight duty period, you also have to see what activities are carried out, what are permitted before, during and after the period of duty. So, for example, and what happens in the EU system, and it is different, we chose to be different from the US, I have no apology for that. We think it's equivalent, but we chose to be different. The EU system focuses to a much higher extent on rest before flight duties to avoid fatigue. So I'm sorry, we're not more superhuman than the US. We think this is a way to provide an equivalent level of safety. The US system, therefore, shortens the flight duties, but does not require the same level of rest before. We have slightly longer flight duties, but more rest before. We think these are two equivalent ways to ensure an equivalent safety level. On the question of non-regression, again, not at all surprised to hear that. It's an issue, I think, close to a number of people's hearts. You mentioned it, Mr. Kadroy, Mrs. Lichtenberg, you mentioned it, Mr. Van Dalen as well. Let me again be very, very clear. Are Member States allowed to apply more protective safety rules under the EASA opinion? The answer is yes. What the regulation we have, 216/2008, what that says is that harmonised aviation safety rules replace national rules to try to ensure what we've all been looking for, this common level of protection, mutual recognition and a level playing field according to the best available science and experience. But national specific deviations can be notified to the Commission or EASA in accordance with the rules, and so that is permitted. They're not automatic, but they are allowed. Why do we allow that? Because there are going to be occasions when you've got, for example, the fatiguing effect of severe winter weather, for example, we've seen recently in a particular locality, and the Member State says we need a deviation there. You have long night periods in the Scandinavian countries in winter. So again, they might look for a specific deviation there. On the specific question of non-regression, or some call it the safety enhancement clause, we've been asked repeatedly, and again today, should we allow a provision in the FTL rules themselves, in the articles of the regulation, to clarify that Member States are allowed to apply more protective safety rules? Legally speaking, we take the view that it's not necessary to introduce a new provision into the text of the articles itself, clarifying that this deviation may be done through the existing flexibility provisions, because the current EU process is very clear in this respect. Regulation 216, I think, is very clear on the relations between national legislation and EU safety rules. But if this is still an issue, and I'm hearing it from my contacts with the different stakeholders, if this is still an issue, we are ready. I think we've already made it clear that we are ready to include a recital in this under the future proposal. And that, by the way, is exactly what happens now in the EU OPS system. Standby periods. Again, I'm unsurprised to hear a number of questions on this. This is a very important question. And Mrs. Meisner, you raised this in particular, along with Mr. Van Dalen and others. And let me ask the question in a direct way. Does the EASA opinion allow a pilot to fly an aircraft after being waited for 22 hours or 30 hours, I heard Mr. Kramer? And let me say, I completely agree with you. I do not want to go under the knife. I do not want to get into a plane where the pilot's been awake for 30 hours. But it does not, I'm glad to say, permit that, for two main reasons. Firstly, the EASA proposal puts unconditional obligations, very clear obligations on Member States, on airlines and on aircrew members to ensure realistic and safe rosters. Even if the rosters are not written by Mrs. Foster, this is the obligation that will be made, and they have to apply these clear fatigue management principles. These obligations prevail. They prevail over the maximum limits, and they have to be respected under all circumstances. So the concept is, the idea of the FTL system, is there are limits in law, and that in addition you have operators' flight schemes that have to be approved by the national authorities that check the overall safety levels. So even in theory, even if in theory you have extreme schemes within the limits allowed by law, the authorities have the power to require the changes if in their assessment the schemes would not be safe. the obligations imply that a crew member has to use these sleep opportunities during the standby period, as he or she becomes aware of the timing of the possible flights. We have mandatory fatigue management training to instruct crew members how to best plan their rest when on standby. This is a collective thing. This is not about the Commission or Member States or airlines insisting on rules. It's a shared enterprise amongst, for a dedicated and highly professional group of employees who know themselves how to improve fatigue management. And I know from talking to them how committed they are to working on this. The second big area of reason why we're not faced with this horrible idea of 30 hours is because crew members are required not to perform duties. If all of this, the first set of mechanisms doesn't work, they are required not to perform duties if they feel they are suffering from excessive fatigue. The examples that we often hear of crew from different people, of a crew member getting up at the beginning of a standby period between 5 and 7 o'clock in the morning, theoretically leading up to, 20 hours or more awake, are based on the wrong assumption, and a wrong assumption about the responsibility of airline crew members. A responsible crew member would remain in bed if he or she is not called by the airline, given that the rule we all have requires a reasonable response time, allowing the crew member to get from his or her place of rest to the airport. This wouldn't allow, we don't think, on our assessment, more than 18 hours awake, and that we believe is reasonable according to scientific studies. So, I know this is a complex and a controversial area. This is an area where we're continuing to work very hard to try to bring everyone on board. But this is where we've got to, and I hope those general remarks are useful. To Mrs. Foster, I'm grateful in your confidence that we will bring forward the right conclusions. Like you, I don't like the scaremongering. I've said so publicly before. I don't think I need to repeat that. And thanks for your support to this process. To Mrs. Lichtenberger, and also, Mr. Chairman, you addressed this point. I'm sorry you've not learned more from what we've said today. I'm sorry you've not learned from the process, but I have a fundamental constraint, which is I am but a humble employee of the Commission, and we have not yet, we are not ready to put on the table a proposal. So it's difficult for me to say, and indeed you'd be bored silly if I went through all the different parts of the proposal that we haven't yet made. So bear with us, and I'm very glad we'll have the hearing where we can actually then stand before you and say, here's our proposal, and stand or fall on that. You asked about science-based. Again, Jean-Marc, if I ever give you the moment to speak, it will be science-based, and it must be science-based. And again, we stand or fall on that, and we'll want to examine that with you. You're quite right, Mr. Lichtenberger, when you say it's a complex process, and the details count. And that's why we are ending up with quite a complex proposal, I think. We will have the regulations. We will have a lot of soft law in certification specification in terms of acceptable means of compliance, in terms of information to people how to apply the system. And we do attach a lot of importance to all the different elements. You mentioned low-cost airlines. Let me repeat very clearly, they are subject, they will be subject, they must be subject to exactly the same safety controls. This is a system that will apply to all. I think I'm now at the point where I'm starting to repeat myself, which is entertaining for me but distressing for you. Just perhaps to Mr. Bach, I could say one thing, except he's left. To Mr. Bach, just to say we have looked consistently to make improvements. This is not just a sort of a minimum service trying to get by with less. We've looked to make a number of safety improvements. Let me just list 3 of them. I've mentioned night flights, reducing the maximum flight duty period. In the area of cumulative duty, additional limits every 14 days and again every 12 months. And rest, when you've had disruptive schedules, twice a month from 1 to 2 local days. Again, I hope systematic improvements. I'm running out of breath. Jean-Marc, if we have any time left, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. So I would like to come back to the scientific assessment conducted by the agency, and then also to the comparison between the US system and the European system. So first on science, what I would like to stress, it has been stressed already by Matthew, the mandate of the agency was to review the existing rules on the basis of the latest scientific and medical evidence. So this was central in the work of the agency. Take the latest scientific and medical evidence as a basis. And to do this, not only the agency, but also the group of experts that the agency has gathered to support the agency in his work. So the agency and the experts have reviewed more than 50 scientific studies. What has to be said on science is that there is no science with a capital S. What we realized through reviewing very carefully those scientific studies is that sometimes you may have two studies on the same subject and they don't lead to the same conclusion. So you have really to make up your mind on which conclusion you take. And in order to do this assessment, you have to review the study, of course, and understand the context in which the study has been conducted. We've faced the case of many studies conducted in the US with flight time limitation regulations, which at the time where the studies were conducted were totally different to the EU system and far less protective. So this introduced mechanically a bias in the result of the study. So 50 studies that we reviewed. For some studies, we could take the result quantitatively. For some, we could only take the result qualitatively, and for some of them, we found them irrelevant. If we take, for instance, I think a good example is the night duty. I think that the night duty has been discussed to quite some extent. We have today an EU regulation which says the maximum is 11 hours 45. We propose to reduce it to 11 hours, and we've heard many commenters telling us, well, science says it's 10 hours, and the agency proposal flies into the face of science. But what science are we speaking about? There is one scientific study concluding that the flight time at night should be limited to 10 hours. The title of the study is The Hajj Operation, Alertness of Aircrew on Return Flights Between Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. It's a very specific study on a very specific environment, and when you read the study, you realize that the study is not only on night flights, the study is on the complex combination of night duties, time zone crossing, disruptive schedules, which means one day you start early, the other day you start late, which disturbs the internal body clock, and then being a long time out of base. What we've addressed in our proposal is not only the night duties, but in order to take this study into account, we've addressed as well time zone crossing, where we've significantly improved the existing regulation. We've addressed disruptive schedule, which today is not addressed in the EU regulation and is addressed only in one member state in Europe. And we've also addressed the effect of changing home base. With this in mind, we do believe that 11 hours at night, when the environment is protected, which means that enough rest is given before, enough rest is given later, you protect against the effect of time zone crossing, you protect against the effect of disruptive schedules. With this, we do believe that 11 hours at night is safe. One amusing thing about this issue is that the same scientists who concluded that the flight time at night should be limited to 10 hours developed a simulation tool called the SAFE model, which is used by some member states to simulate the alertness level of the crew. We've used this simulation tool developed by the same scientist, and when you use this simulation tool, you conclude that the alertness level with 11 hours of flight time at night and 10 hours at night are comparable. So even scientists, sometimes they may contradict themselves. So it's very important to take science very carefully. The first thing to do when someone has a report in their hands is not to jump to the conclusion, but to read the report and try to understand the context in which the science has been conducted. And then a couple of words. Another thing on science is that, as Mr. Simpson say, there is no today a comprehensive scientific assessment of subpart Q. There has been a few studies on very specific points, conducted on very specific environment, sometime in Europe, sometime in the US. But of course, a scientific assessment can only be done on a regulation in place, because the regulation sets the environment. And if you don't have the environment, you may have difficulties to reproduce the conclusion of a scientific study. It is the reason why we are proposing, and it is in the agency opinion, that the agency conducts a scientific assessment of the regulation once they are in place. So when it is in place, then we can really conduct a scientific assessment of the effect of this regulation on the alertness of flight and cabin crew, and possibly further improve those rules in the future. And then a couple of words on the US versus EU regulations. It's very difficult to compare point by point two regulations which are based on different assumptions. It is right that in the US rules, the maximum flight duty period at night is 9 hours, and our proposal is 11 hours. But you have to compare the whole package. And there is a significant difference between the US rules and what we propose, and also currently with EU OPS, is the rest requirement. In terms of rest requirement, our proposal, which is based on EU OPS and includes lots of improvement from EU OPS, in terms of rest requirement, are far more protective than the EU OPS. And that's the fundamental principle of EU OPS and now the agency proposal, is that we have very protective rest requirements in order to ensure that the crew is, in all cases, in a good alertness situation before every flight. That's the big difference. 9 hours at night in the US is in a context where the rest requirements are far less. And I'm quite sure that if you ask a pilot or a cabin crew, if you had to choose between two packages, between the US package and the EU package, they would not hesitate 1 second, they would choose the EU package. And one more thing about the US rule, you may be aware that the US rules apply only to pilot. Cabin crew fatigue is not regulated in the US. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you both for that, for the report back and the answering of the questions. As has been said, we will be having a hearing on that. May be interested in the hearing to bring somebody from the United States to tell us how wonderful their system is compared to everybody else's. But that's something we'll need to think of within the coordinators. I've no other business. Can I just remind you that the date and place of the next meeting is Monday, the 25th of March at 1500 hours. Thank you all. Thank the interpreters for their work as well.